Good to be back. Today we're going to cover the first half of the 19th century, the early Republic era, the Antebellum era, that is the era before the Civil War. Depending on time, I'm going to take us through period 4, that is 1800 to 1848, and if we can, partway into period 5, the road to the Civil War, basically the road to disunion. I'm going to do it a little differently order than I did the last time, where we'll do the DBQ at the end. And if you want to stay for the DBQ, I'll be happy to talk through it with you. And if not, you're welcome to go off on your own. But the DBQ is a DBQ from a few years ago about the rise of anti-slavery politics in the context of basically what happens in America from 1776 to 1852. The DBQ is uploaded onto the PMTV website. It should be there for you to pull easily. And this lecture is basically all the context to set up that DBQ. So we'll tackle that, with the last 15 or 20 minutes of the class. And if I need to stop the material earlier, I will, because I do want to make sure that students have enough time to sort of read through and think about how they would handle this DBQ. Okay. Next week, we'll finish period 5, Reconstruction, and we'll cover Gilded Age America after that in the last of next week's session. Okay, so last time, in talking about the road to the American Revolution and the birth of the new nation, I focused on American national identity, on how the experiences of the 7 Years' War, followed by subsequent British policies, helped forge a shape of an American national identity, leading to the American Revolution, and eventually to the Constitution and the US government as we more or less know it today. Today, I'm going to touch on most, if not all, of the APUSH themes, but I'm going to note a couple you'll hear. I'm going to note politics and power and work, exchange, and technology in particular, and there'll be a decent bit on social structures and on migration and settlement along the way, especially in the later half of this discussion. But as an overview for today, let me sort of talk about politics and power, just sort of map where we're going. We're going to be talking about the arc from the Revolution of 1800, when the country sees its first peaceful transfer of power, something that all the monarchists in Europe didn't think was possible, from Federalist John Adams to Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. And we'll take that up into the 1850s and the birth of the Republican Party and the two-party system as we know it. This is a period, as I'm sure you know, about war and expansion, about the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, of the Louisiana Purchase, and of course of Manifest Destiny as a dominant ideology of the United States. This is a period when the United States goes from the eastern half of the continent at 1803 to literally the full lower 848 states, not in statehood, but sort of having the control of the territory that make up the 48 continental states by 1853. This is, of course, also the era of the Trail of Tears, and it debates over whether the new territories added to the United States would be free territories or territories that allowed slavery. This is an era where national leaders tried and failed, almost necessarily, to reconcile the country's fundamental contradiction. How could a republic based on the notion of liberty enslave quite literally millions of people of African descent? As it turned out, slavery did not wither away, which looked like it might be the case as of around 1790, but rather grew dramatically in political, economic, and cultural power over the first half of the 1800s. And as that happened, the gap between pro and anti-slavery forces widened to the point of no return. In terms of the major themes, the major content of today and this period for work, exchange, and technology, this is an era known as the era of the market revolution, an era of economic and technological innovations where we have new canals, new steamships, new railroads and telegraphs that connected Americans like never before, and ushered in an age of industrial capitalism as we still more or less recognize it, certainly with all sorts of advances and changes, but nonetheless something that looks increasingly recognizable. goods and people moved around the country, the growing country, in greater numbers and at greater speed. Immigration to the United States picks up, as does anti-immigrant backlash. In the South, cotton becomes king, while in the North, the industrial factory system takes hold and urbanization picks up speed quite dramatically. This helps exacerbate the divide between the North and the South. New cities emerge in the United States, most notably Chicago, linking the industrial East and the emerging industries and agricultural power of the Midwest and the Western territories. And as all this is happening, as the political changes are happening, as economic changes and technological changes are happening, social status in this country also sort of becomes, more and more complex. As the economy expands, as the nation quite literally expands, as politicians in the Jefferson era and the Jacksonian era talk about liberty, extending the vote to virtually all white men, new literary movements, artistic movements such as the Transcendentalists come about, and there are new protest movements like abolitionism and women's suffrage that question the social structure of the rapidly changing country, and who fundamentally was entitled to that liberty, to that full citizenship in the American Republic. Now, clearly we're talking, in covering 1800 to 1850, maybe 1860 today, we're covering what your teacher would probably spend at least a month on, maybe more. So I'm going to hit some highlights. There's lots of detail I'm not going to begin to get into, but I want to give you a map and ideas to think about how to make sense of an era that, I've got to say, in teaching American history, I think that the antebellum era, along with the progressives, which we'll get to in 2 weeks, are two of the eras that students often have a tough time wrapping their minds around. Sort of like, the colonial period is so different that it's sort of, there's a fascination with, ooh, what was going on? Anything from World War I forward is relatively familiar, and is, the details are important, but it makes intuitive sense. But I think that this is a particularly difficult period to get a handle on, and so I'll help you do that today. When Thomas Jefferson, and I'll also remind you, of course, that there's study term lists now on the website for period 4, and the period 4 study guide that should go through 1848. I've got it going through 1860. I'll repeat some of that next week as well. When Thomas Jefferson takes office in 1801, he does so in a half-finished new capital city, Washington, D.C. When Thomas Jefferson became president after the peaceful transfer of power from the Federalists, he sought to roll back Alexander Hamilton's agenda, in particular the Federalist agenda of building a strong centralized state and laying the foundation for an industrial economy. Ironically, however, both Jefferson and his successor, James Madison, who was a co-author of the Federalist Papers, as you may remember, with Alexander Hamilton, and sharply disagreed with Hamilton on a lot, both Jefferson and Madison lead administrations that saw the enhancement, not the rollback, of the power of the new federal government. Under Jefferson, the United States purchases the Louisiana Territory from France for about $15 million, an act that even Jefferson thought was beyond the powers of the president, but one that he thought would benefit the United States so much that he couldn't pass this opportunity up. And you can see on the map how, quite literally, it doubles the territory of the country. Madison, as president after Jefferson, had let the First National Bank expire. The First National Bank, you may remember, was something that Alexander Hamilton fought hard for to help establish the financial credit of the new country and to help sort of, again, build the foundation for the industrial economy he saw coming. However, Madison had to deal with the economic turmoil that brought about by the War of 1812, and ultimately supported the chartering of a second national bank, one that Andrew Jackson let expire 20 years after that. But we'll come back to that later. But the first and second national banks, though they don't last for the long term, nonetheless set the groundwork for the federal government playing a major role in regulating a national economy. There's a couple of Supreme Court decisions in here I want to point to as well that begin to sort of show the power of a growing judiciary. of the third branch of government that we haven't talked about until now. The first is Marbury versus Madison, which if there's a case from the 19th century, you know, there's a good chance it's this. It establishes the precedent of judicial review. The second, in 1819, under James Monroe, McCulloch versus Maryland establishes the supremacy of the federal government over individual states, and declares, sort of in line with the Constitution, that the federal government does have powers that are not necessarily spelled out in the original text. So all of this sort of adds up to a growing federal government, one that has more power than the individual states, a theme we've talked about last week with the Articles of Confederation and the writing of the Constitution. Under Monroe, the US enters an era called the era of good feelings. Temporarily, the United States is effectively a one-party country when the Federalist Party withers away after its defeat in 1816. The Democratic Republicans, now renaming themselves the Democratic Party, are the only major party of any kind of note. But there are still, of course, all sorts of political divides. More often, they're coming on regional lines, you know, in the language of the pre-Civil War era, on sectional lines. And you know, when you review your notes, when you review your textbook, you'll see references to sectionalism along the way, and that's getting to the divides, especially between the North and the South, and the various economic and political interests in both parts of the country, in those two parts of the country. Even as the Federalist Party withers away, the economic vision endorsed by Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists really becomes more and more the norm in antebellum America. The fundamental economic transformations of the early 1800s are collectively known as the market revolution. This is an era of, and I noted this a second ago, of huge advancements in manufacturing, in communications, in transportation, and in other technologies that spurred economic growth, industrialization, and urbanization. Now, the colonial era was dramatic in all sorts of other ways, but not so much in the changes of technology between the early 1600s and the mid 1700s. Most of goods were produced by hand, by artisans. Roads were little more than paths. Moving goods over land, over short distances, was basically as slow and as expensive as getting them all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. But very early, in the early 1800s, things changed dramatically with the development of steamboats, with the development of canals and railroads and telegraphs, pulling the United States economy into a new era. Almost certainly your textbook has lots of details about, say, the building of public roads, or about Robert Fulton's invention of the steamship, or Samuel Morse's invention of the telegraph. I want to get across the idea that goods are flowing, people are flowing, and information is flowing. Telegraphs, for example, helped fuel the rise of newspapers as we recognize them, and to mass literacy. And we'll come back to that during the rise of anti-slavery publications. You'll certainly want to know about the construction of the Erie Canal, the 360+ mile canal that links New York City with the Great Lakes all the way to Chicago. The building of this canal basically makes New York City the economic dynamo of the East Coast and of the, this side of the ocean, while opening up the Midwest, since you can now move goods by water up the Hudson River, across the Erie Canal, and through the Great Lakes, all the way to Chicago. And this dramatically enhances production, and I'll say more about that in a second. By the late 1830s, as you can see on this map, there's more than 3,000 miles of canals now linking the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley with the East Coast. These canals, plus the steamships on the Mississippi River, on the Great Lakes, on the Ohio River, change 19th century America every bit as much as cars and highways and airplanes changed the 20th century. Now, all of these lands open all these developments, the steamships, the railroads, the first railroads, the canals, open new land to settlement, lower transportation costs, and make selling goods easier than ever before. They link farmers to national and world markets. They make Americans consumers of manufactured goods. And again, you see the rise of new cities, St. Louis on the Mississippi River, Cincinnati on the Ohio River. Well, those Cincinnati's not on the map, but basically at that point where basically along the Ohio-Kentucky border. And especially Chicago on the shores of Lake Michigan. In early 1830s, Chicago was only a tiny outpost. By 1860, it's the fourth largest city in the country, as farm products from the upper Northwestern territory, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, and so on, are now sent east from Chicago by railroad. All of this also fuels the growth of the factory system, first most extensively in New England. Factories replaced small groups of workers who had been, up until this point for decades, even centuries, making goods by hand. Now you have new equipment, new technologies like power looms in the textile industry in particular that allow for cotton to be spun into yarn, then into cloth, and eventually into clothing, linens, and the like. Over time, you would not just be, over time you would create factories, factory owners built facilities that would allow goods to go from natural resource to finished product under one house. Perhaps ironically, the War of 1812 cut off the United States from British imports, forcing American manufacturers to sort of up their output dramatically. And this helps fuel the Industrial Revolution in New England. In 1814, one group of merchants built the first large-scale factory in Waltham, just west of Boston. And in the 1820s, the first factory town opens in Lowell, Massachusetts, which you can see on this map. The Lowell, which is on the Merrimack River, becomes the model for factory towns across New England. The river is important because the waterfalls and the rapids of this river, and then the other rivers, Fall River, for example, fuel the textile mills of New England. They literally are moving the spinning and weaving machinery. And factories and factory towns spread across eastern New England, as you can see, and Massachusetts in particular becomes the world's second most industrialized region, second only to Great Britain. The textile industry drove a lot of this development, but very soon you have growth of industries making shoes, making ironworks, or ironworks making iron goods, agricultural goods, firearms, and much more. And each town would have its paper mills, its sawmills, its ironworks, and many other small enterprises. And with all of this comes really the rise of wage labor. The basic idea that you make X cents or X dollars for this many hours of your work, as opposed to having a fixed price for a good that or a service that you're going to provide. And so having these kind of wages really changes how Americans live, and having these kinds of sort of this economic exchange, and also speeds things up as time becomes more important, that you're tracking hours, that you even have time zones, that you are paying attention to time in a new way to make sure that, say, if you're on a train from Boston to New York, you want to make sure that everyone knows that it's the same time and that you don't have accidents because you all think something is 3 minutes apart from each other. And this did happen early in the industrial age. New workers come for these jobs. Many of the new workers in the mills come from Europe. Between 1840 and 1860, over 4 million people immigrate to the United States. That's more than the entire population of the United States had been in 1790. The majority of those immigrants come from Ireland and Germany. And the immigrants overwhelmingly went to the North and the Midwest and not to the South. There's a push and pull factor that drives immigration. In Europe, people are getting pushed out of their jobs by new technologies, agriculture is modernized, and just a lot of the old jobs disappear. There's also factors like the Irish famine, the potato famine of the 1830s, revolutions across the continent in the 1840s, especially in 1848, that drive Irish and German immigration in particular to the United States. This also marks, in the case of the Irish and some Germans, the first large-scale Catholic immigration to the United States. And you do see in the 1840s and 1850s a rise of what became known as nativism, an anti-immigrant politics rooted in the vision that these new arrivals, who had a different religion than most Americans here, and in some cases spoke different languages, represented a threat to American values and to the jobs of Americans. While I tend to talk about American history and history in general, rhyming rather than repeating, the threads we see in opposition to immigrants, German and Italians in this period, Italians, Jews, Russians, and other Southern and Eastern Europeans in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Chinese in the late 1800s, runs all the way certainly through resistance to Asian, Latino, and other migration to the United States in the late the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century. I talked about immigrants coming for new jobs. These textile mills also bring women and children into the workforce, especially in the New England textile mills. In Lowell, Massachusetts, and I'm going to point by tell you if you're taking the subject test, they love to ask about this, about the factory system and how women and children were employed there. In Lowell and elsewhere, mill owners provided housing for young women and girls, some boys as well, guided by very strict rules on personal behavior and moral instruction. So keep an eye out for that if you take the subject test. Over time, you have, in the interest of time, I'm not going to get deeply into some of the literary movements also come up on the subject test, like the Transcendentalists. But there is a reaction to how industrialization is changing the landscape of the country and how it's changing Americans' relationship with each other and to their work. You'll see references to Transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and to Henry David Thoreau, who focus on the emancipation of the individual threatened by new developments. And as we saw in the colonial period, there's a language of metaphorical slavery that's quite distinct from the actual practice of slavery and even from the abolitionist movement that's happening at the same time. Walden, Thoreau's Walden, you may have read in high school, you might read it in college if you haven't, talked about civil disobedience, talked about the consciousness of the individual, and wrote his essay on civil disobedience in opposition to the Mexican-American War. And that essay is one of many key influences on Martin Luther King and the nonviolent civil disobedience of the Civil Rights era. You may see questions about the Second Great Awakening. It may work into a DBQ, it may work into subject test questions, but the religious revolutions of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s that emphasized self-reliance, self-determination, personal improvement, that rejected the sort of rational deism of the founding fathers. And you see a mass expansion of American Protestantism at this time, especially newer denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists, and the rise of entirely new religions like the Church of Latter-day Saints. You see all sorts of utopian communities. I'm not going to go into the details here, but all sorts of communities like the Shakers, the Oneida, Robert Owen's New Harmony community in Indiana, that all emphasize personal behavior, personal improvement, and perfectionism within a rapidly changing society. These movements all help, especially with the emphasis on personal liberty and personal improvement, help fuel the reform movements of this period as well. You see temperance movements that eventually culminate in the early 20th century with the Prohibition. At this period, the temperance movement is a response to social ills and a belief in that alcoholism is a personal failing. And there is a nativist streak to this as well, under the perception that some of the newer immigrant groups drank more than the Protestant Americans already here. You have all sorts of new institutions like prisons, asylums, poorhouses, and orphanages that are created with, the idea of helping individuals as creating places where people could be separate from everybody else and work on reforming their character. As you can imagine, many of those institutions turned out to be places that were much more hellish than that noble intention. You have the first large-scale public school systems in the North, not so much in the South. And the Second Great Awakening helps fuel the two biggest reform movements of this period, the abolition movement, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the women's suffrage movement. You do have in here the rise of a new women's movement, a movement that rejected some of the ideological developments of the 19th century for particularly white middle class and upper class women. The ideas of separate spheres where women were entitled to speak at home, but only men could speak in public. And the cult of domesticity, which sort of raised the role of elite women and middle class women to putting them effectively on a pedestal by talking about their noble work in the home and thus sort of reinforcing that they couldn't speak elsewhere. The most notable part of the women's movement during this period was the movement for women's voting rights, which culminated in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 in upstate New York, which really drives the 70-year movement for women's voting rights. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments is modeled on the Declaration of Independence, listing grievances not on the part of King George III, but, quote, on the part of man toward woman. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, put the vote first on the list of many women's demands, arguing that only the vote would make woman as free as man is free. At this point in time, women's suffrage advocates are arguing for the vote on the basis that women are equal. I want to point this out because when we come to the women's suffrage movement of the early 20th century, those suffrage advocates will argue that women are distinct, are different, and that their special roles as mothers, as wives, makes it necessary that they have a role, that women have a role in the public sphere. At this time, though, the argument is based on equality. And there are frequent references, there are frequent connections drawn between the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement. The two key organizers for Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, were both very active in the abolition movement. Angela Grimke and Sarah Grimke, two white sisters who were very prominent speaking out against slavery in the South, spoke very directly to the importance of not being limited just to the domestic sphere, but having a voice in the public sphere, and to the importance of women having the vote. And Frederick Douglass, arguably the leading abolitionist of the 19th century, attended Seneca Falls, frequently drew the connection as well between the movement to free slaves and for women to have full political rights. All right. Sort of keeping track of time here, I want to step back for a second just to, we talked a second ago about railroads, about canals. Looking at this map, for example, you see how few of those railroads and canals, well, this is only of the key roads and canals, but by and large, not much in the South. Across the New England, in the new states of the former Northwest Territory, not nearly as much in the South. Travel time, people can move across, both people can move themselves quicker, goods can move more quickly because of the railroads and canals. People are beginning to move west in ever greater numbers, and pretty much the region east of the Mississippi begins to fill up more and more with white settlers. By 1840, 7 million Americans, about 40% of the population, lives west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, I do want to bring, the people are not moving to the South. Immigrants are not coming to the South. The immigration to the United States from Europe, more than 90%, well past 90%, in fact, went to the Northeast or the Midwest, not to the South. And the economic differences between the North and Midwest on the one hand and the South on the other are beginning to grow wider and wider. I mentioned early in this lecture about how it looked like slavery was beginning to fade away. Some of the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, like James Monroe, were slaveholders, but they were also ill-inclined to defend slavery, the so-called peculiar institution that seemed to defy notions of liberty. And they seemed to suggest at that point that slavery would eventually, gradually be abolished, especially as northern states moved directly towards abolition. You do have a ban on the international slave trade in 1808. The British also banned slavery, but the 1793 invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney changes everything. The invention of the cotton gin makes the slave society of the Old South the largest and most powerful slave society in modern history. And even though there's a ban on the international slave trade in 1808, a massive domestic slave trade emerges with more than 2 million slaves sold within the United States between 1820 and 1860. Before the Revolutionary War, slavery was overwhelmingly centered on the tobacco growing regions of the greater Chesapeake area. Now slavery becomes pervasive throughout the Old South. As cotton becomes king, as the cotton gin makes it possible to cultivate the crop pretty much across the southeastern United States. And this becomes fundamentally intertwined with industrialization, as the cotton grown by slaves, picked by slaves in the South, goes to fuel the mill, or goes to be processed in the mills of New England and beyond. And in fact, is processed in the mills of Britain, of France, even of Russia. Cotton is shipped from the South to the North and beyond on steamships. The South doesn't industrialize at this point, not yet, like the North and the Midwest begin to do. The Southern economy instead revolves around slavery and around cotton, not on manufacturing, which in part would doom the Confederacy during the Civil War. The South is dominated by planter elites, even though most of the population of the white South were poor farmers or sort of middling yeoman farmers. 3/4 of the whites in the South did not own slaves. But despite critics and despite these numbers, very few openly challenged the slavocracy of the Old South. One South Carolina senator declared, "No power on earth dares to make war upon it, on the South. Cotton is king." You do have a change in the language about slavery. Unlike Jefferson, unlike Monroe, who thought that slavery would wither away, John Calhoun, who we'll come back to in a bit, the senator, longtime senator from South Carolina, longtime congressman, vice president under Jackson, saw slavery not as a necessary evil, but a positive good, arguing even that slaves benefited from their enslavement and that they were treated better than the textile workers in New England. Any study of slavery will tell you how false this is. You had more and more arguments emerging in the Old South that slavery reflected a natural order of things, a righteous hierarchy, drawing sometimes on Christianity and religious texts, sometimes on the natural language of the Declaration of Independence. I mentioned the other time how framing rights in terms of natural can have the side effect of diminishing those people who are not seen to be naturally equal or judged to be naturally equal. And here we have a key example of that. Slaves do flee to New Orleans and Charleston on the coasts to get lost in the big city crowds, to the swamps, say, of Florida or Eastern Virginia, to the Underground Railroad that transports slaves from the Deep South to freedom above the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line. You have many slave revolts, most famously Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831. And you do have a growing abolitionist movement. It's fueled by the Second Great Awakening, And slavery to abolitionists represents both a secular sin against the Declaration of Independence and its language of natural rights, and to religious texts. And you have a shift here from the belief by abolitionists that slavery would gradually end to a demand for immediate abolition. You have both Black and white leaders in the growing abolitionist movement, many of whom take advantage of the new newspapers, the rise in literacy, to promote an anti-slavery message in newspapers, in pamphlets and broadsides. The most famous of these publications was The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison, based in Boston, ran what was, again, the most important abolitionist journal in the country. And it savaged the sin of slavery and of slaveholders, having no interest in compromise, not like the compromises that American politicians, North and South, were trying to come up with to keep the Union together. Unlike the slave revolts, abolitionists tend to be pacifists. They did actively appeal to the Declaration of Independence, to the language and symbols of the revolution, to push for their cause. All right. Given time, I'm not going to spend as much time as I might otherwise on the Jacksonian period, on the period of Andrew Jackson. And in general, manifest destiny is among the topics I cover, despite what I said about the rest of the antebellum period. By and large, students get into manifest destiny, that this is about sort of the idea that the United States had a God-given right and destiny to expand across the continent. But I want to hit on some major notes of the Jackson period to sort of frame what's coming, and especially with what's coming with the Civil War. We'll probably go for about another 5-7 minutes and then sort of turn to the DBQ. Andrew Jackson was, other than Lincoln himself, probably the most polarizing president of the 19th century. And Jackson represented the contradictions of of America at this point in time. One that champions individualism and self-initiative, the expansion of voter rights to near universal status among white men. One, Jackson builds on Thomas Jefferson's dream of an agrarian republic. Jackson is also perhaps best remembered for his brutal wars against Native Americans, or especially his attempt to disenfranchise them and force them out of their ancestral lands, and his belief that African Americans should either remain enslaved or be returned to Africa. During the Jackson period, a new party system temporarily emerges to replace the early Federalist, anti-Federalist divide. Jackson's Democratic Party is met by the Whig Party that succeeds the Federalists as the party of Northern industrialists and some others. Andrew Jackson, by and large, supported a weaker federal government, killing off the Second National Bank, for example, and opposing tariffs, in contrast, in direct opposition to the Whigs, who were pro-National Bank, who were pro-tariff. But Jackson turned out to have some key limits in these challenges to federal power, despite his general support for states' rights. During his presidency, South Carolina tried to nullify a tariff, arguing that its laws, despite McCulloch versus Maryland, were supreme to that of the federal government. And when South Carolina defied the federal government, Jackson got Congress to pass legislation allowing him to use the Army and Navy to collect customs duties. It's pretty ironic that Andrew Jackson, who is the staunch defender of states' rights and of limited government, becomes the first president of the United States to embrace the willingness of using armed force to protect the power of the federal government and, in fact, of the Union itself. It's also worth noting that Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun, from South Carolina, was secretly the leading theorist of nullification, drafting the ideas of states' rights that were used not just against this tariff in 1832, but were later used by Southern politicians in the succession crisis when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. And for that matter, in response to Brown versus Board of Education, in response to all sorts of civil rights legislation, and more broadly, in various other causes evoking states' rights in the 20th and even into the 21st centuries. Jackson also builds his career, Jackson also stakes a major claim to expanding the power of the federal government and territory of the United States vis-a-vis Native Americans. Jackson had come to fame in part by fighting Native Americans along with the British during the War of 1812. Now, during his presidency, the Native peoples of the Southeast were in the way, so to speak, of the expanding Cotton Empire. And under Jackson, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which lays the plan to move 60,000 Native Americans, primarily from the Southeast, of moving the so-called 5 civilized tribes in the language of the day: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Choctaw, and moving them from the Southeast, where their lands could be used for cotton growing, to the Indian Territory of what later became Oklahoma. Jackson rejects the Jeffersonian idea of assimilating some Native Americans into the United States, even those who are adopting laws on tribal lands like American laws, who are converting to Christianity. The Indian Trail of Tears doesn't happen until Jackson has retired and is under his successor, Martin Van Buren. But in 1838, 1839, the US Army forces 18,000 people on gunpoint, 18,000 Native Americans at gunpoint, to march west to the Indian Territory of what becomes Oklahoma. And during that forced march, at least a quarter of the participants do perish along the way. During this period, voluntary movement westward also accelerates, as white Americans begin trekking across the Great Plains, across the Rocky Mountains and the deserts even, all the way into Oregon, the Oregon Territory, and into California. In the 1820s, a few thousand Americans, mostly from the South, had poured into the northeastern Mexico state of Texas, and eventually revolt against the Mexican government, winning independence in 1836. At the time, Jackson and then Van Buren put off Texas's call to join the United States because they want to avoid the controversies that would certainly erupt from adding another slaveholding state to the Union. But in 1845, Congress declares Texas to be part of the United States, setting the US and Mexico on the road to conflict. You have a new president in 1845, James Polk. One of his major planks, he works out a deal with the British to divide the Oregon Territory. The northern part of the Oregon Territory went to the British, which is now the Canadian province of British Columbia, while the rest became Washington and Ohio State and the western part of Idaho. Actually, let me go back to the map of this map. Polk also tries to work out a deal to buy California. Mexico refuses to sell California to the United States, and war erupts. And over the next 2 years, the United States and Mexicans fight a war. It's the first war where US troops operate on foreign soil. There's much opposition to this war among Whigs, among critics like Thoreau, who see this as, first, an attempt to expand slavery, and B, a war that only is justified because Mexico refused to sell its own territory to the United States. But US forces triumph in 1848, and the northern third of Mexico becomes the United States. And on this map, we're talking about pretty much all the territory of California, Nevada, Utah, decent chunks of Arizona, New Mexico, and western Colorado. And to sort of wind down, and said, I'll have to get back to the road to the Civil War briefly next time, but I want to get across the idea how manifest destiny is really shaped by territorial expansion and vice versa, by racial ideology and vice versa. The Mexican cession, adding all of this extra territory, adds another 75,000, 100,000 Spanish-speaking Mexicans to the country, and another 150,000 Native Americans. manifest destiny, this ideology of spreading westward really defines Americans in terms of what citizens were not, not Mexican, not Catholic, not Native American, not African American. And this becomes all the more complicated as immigration to California picks up dramatically in 1848 with the discovery of gold and the ensuing gold rush. California is quickly admitted to the country as a free state, as settlers pour in from the eastern half of the country. I am going to pause there and pick up next time, but I want to turn to the DBQ. Hopefully you have the DBQ handy, but this DBQ asks us about what are the causes of the, basically what are the various forces that help determine the trajectory of the anti-slavery movement from 1776 to 1852. It's on the PMTV website for today's class. If you're having any trouble finding the website, this is the 2013 DBQ, which will be another, you can Google it if you have trouble finding the PM website. So the question asks, analyze the causes of the growing opposition to slavery in the United States from 1776 to 1852. And in your response, consider both the underlying forces and specific events that contributed to the growing opposition. Now, of course, this is a DBQ that'll have 10 documents. You'll only get 5. But document A is a map of the early emancipation in the northern United States, both in the original states from Pennsylvania north and in the Northwest Territory. Document B is a statement from the 1783 Massachusetts High Court that basically abolishes slavery in the state of Massachusetts. And it's, take a look at that. Document 3 is a letter from a white Philadelphia physician, Benjamin Rust, talking about the growth of the African-American community, the free African-American community in Philadelphia, and its activities towards working for abolition. The 4th document, document D, is a petition from the American Colonization Society, which I should say is a society that took the approach that the best way to address the controversy over slavery was for freed African Americans to return to Africa. And in fact, this did lead to the establishment of the country of Liberia on the western coast of West Africa. Its founders were freed African American slaves, and its capital to this day, Monrovia, is named in honor of James Monroe. I should say, however, that most African Americans then did not particularly support returning to Africa as a solution to the slavery issue. We have an excerpt from William Lloyd Garrison here, that his declaration of the sentiments of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Yeah, his very forceful call to sort of organize against slavery. We have a letter from Angela Grimke in the 6th document, document F, where she calls for, talking about the role of women fighting the scourge of slavery and speaking out in public against slavery. The next document is a document from Frederick Douglass, an excerpt from his autobiography, again, a text that you may have been assigned in high school or might yet be assigned in college, but about his experience, with the brutality of slavery. We have a speech from David Wilmot, a congressman who is known for the Wilmot Proviso, sort of in the anti-slavery debates of the late 1840s and early 1850s. And we have a pamphlet warning African Americans in Boston to beware of the people trying to catch fugitive slaves and return them to their former owners. Tremendous controversy in the 1850 that helped really sort of fuel the divide and put the United States further and further on the road to disunion, onto civil war. So thinking about these documents and thinking about what I've said today, you're going to want to do a close read of the language of these documents, or whichever 5 you pick, but you're also going to want to bring in some of the key documents. How, for example, is Manifest Destiny intertwined with slavery and anti-slavery politics? How is industrialization intertwined with the rise of an anti-slavery movement? How, especially when northern textile mills are using southern cotton picked by slaves and then transported on the new steamboats, through the canals to the north. You may want to talk about the Second Great Awakening and how the religious reforms, the reform movements, fuel opposition to slavery. You're certainly going to want to mention the invention of the cotton gin and the shift from a gradual politics of abolition to a call for dramatic, immediate abolition. I'm going to pause it there. I'll stay on the line if there's any last questions for a couple minutes, but otherwise we'll pick this up next week with the impact, the Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. So thank you all.